8 drones, 1 radar screen, 11 minutes. That's the entire window HMS Diamond's operations room had to answer a question no British warship had faced in over 40 years. Not 1 incoming missile, not 2. A swarm, timed to arrive together, built to do exactly what a swarm is built to do, overwhelm the math. Somewhere below the waterline of a Type 45 destroyer parked in the Bab-el-Mandeb strait, a group of sailors in their 20s were about to find out whether that math still held. The radar screen in question belonged to Samson, mounted high on Diamond's forward mast in its distinctive rotating drum, sweeping the sky and sea around the ship dozens of times a minute. On a quiet night, it shows fishing boats, commercial traffic, the occasional patrol aircraft, a picture so calm it can lull a watchstander into complacency. This was not a quiet night. And 11 minutes, in naval terms, is not a long time to reorganize an entire ship's defensive posture around a threat nobody had briefed as imminent that particular evening. Here's where this is going. By the end of those 11 minutes, HMS Diamond's magazines would be lighter, its gun crews deafened, and the Royal Navy would be sitting on an uncomfortable piece of arithmetic it still hasn't solved. Every drone went down. Nobody could say the defense failed, and yet, somehow, everyone in that operations room walked away certain they'd just watched their own weapon system get outpriced in real time. Diamond is one of 6 Type 45 destroyers the Royal Navy built specifically for air defense. 9,500 tons, a crew of roughly 190, and a radar system called Samson that can supposedly track hundreds of objects across a horizon most ships can't even see over. Its main weapon is Sea Viper, sometimes called PAMs, firing Aster 30 missiles out of vertical launch silos in the forward deck. Each missile has its own tiny rocket motor for terminal steering, closes on a target at several times the speed of sound, and costs the British taxpayer somewhere around £1 million. The missile itself is barely 5 meters long, a slim dart of composite and steel that looks almost unremarkable sitting in a warehouse, until you remember what a single one of them represents in engineering hours, guidance electronics, and decades of NATO air defense doctrine baked into its flight computer. By late 2023, Diamond was part of a growing Royal Navy and coalition presence in the Red Sea, there to keep merchant shipping moving through one of the busiest choke points on Earth. Roughly 12% of global trade passes through that strait in a normal year. Container ships, oil tankers, bulk carriers, all funneled through a gap of water barely 20 miles wide at its narrowest point, with the Yemeni coastline close enough on the port side that a drone launch from shore could reach a transiting vessel in minutes. The threat came from that coast. Houthi forces, backed and armed by Iran, had begun launching drones and missiles at commercial vessels transiting the strait in response to the war in Gaza. Some of that hardware traced directly back to Iranian designs, cheap airframes, a simple guidance kit, a warhead, and a price tag that barely registers as a rounding error next to an Aster 30. Before the drones ever reached Diamond's radar picture that night, they'd already reached someone else's. A bulk carrier registered out of Piraeus, call sign masked in the open-source shipping trackers that later analysts pored over, had been transiting roughly 18 miles ahead of Diamond's station, low in the water with a full load of grain bound for a Red Sea port. Its crew of 22 were mostly Filipino and Greek nationals, men who'd signed contracts for a cargo run and found themselves instead in the middle of what maritime insurers were quietly starting to call the most dangerous shipping lane on the planet. They had no defensive systems beyond a citadel room below decks and a company directive to report any aerial contact immediately. When their bridge watch radioed a visual sighting of low, fast-moving objects skimming the wave tops on a converging bearing, that call was the first hard confirmation Diamond's operations room got that this wasn't a false radar return. Somewhere in that transcript, buried in maritime traffic logs nobody outside the incident review ever saw in full, is the sound of a merchant captain trying to keep his voice level while describing something he had no training to describe. Commander Ben Aldis ran the ship. On the night this story centers on, he wasn't the one who'd see the threat first. That would be a junior warfare officer, staring at a screen in a darkened operations room, watching a single blip appear at the edge of Samson's coverage. then a second blip, then more. One drone is a nuisance. A trained crew handles a single inbound threat almost as routine. 8 is a different problem entirely, and everyone in that room knew it the moment the picture started filling in. Saturation is the word the Royal Navy uses for it, and the concept is ugly in its simplicity. You don't need one weapon smart enough to beat a warship's defenses. You need enough cheap weapons arriving close enough together that the defense runs out of time, munitions, or attention before it runs out of targets. It's not a technology problem. It's an arithmetic problem, and arithmetic doesn't care how advanced your radar is. The operations room began doing exactly what years of drills had trained it to do. Track numbers assigned, bearings called out, speeds and headings fed into the fire control system, cross-checked against known Houthi drone profiles the crew had built up from months of Red Sea patrols. Somewhere in that library was the shape of what was now inbound. Slow, low, buzzing in on a straight line toward the shipping lane Diamond was there to protect. The electronic warfare rating monitoring signals intelligence flagged something else worth noting. A faint, intermittent data link emission consistent with a ground controller adjusting headings mid-flight, which meant this wasn't 8 drones on pre-programmed courses fired and forgotten. Somebody onshore was watching the engagement unfold too, in something close to real time, and making live decisions about where to send the survivors. Here's the part that doesn't sit right, even now. These are not stealth weapons. They fly low and slow, easy to see on a modern radar picture, easy to classify. And they were still going to force a warship worth over £1 billion to empty its magazines just to survive the night intact. Weather wasn't cooperating either. A layer of low haze sat over the strait that night, thick enough to blur the visual horizon, thin enough that Sampson still had eyes on every contact. It meant the gun crews on deck, straining to get eyes on for the close-in fight everyone assumed was coming, would be working half-blind while the missile system did the heavy lifting. Diamond's advantage was going to have to come from steel and software, not from binoculars. The first obstacle wasn't the drones themselves, it was time. Sea Viper needed seconds to calculate solutions for multiple simultaneous targets, seconds the ship didn't have in abundance with 8 contacts converging. The warfare team's answer was blunt: prioritize by proximity and threat profile, fire in sequence rather than waiting for a perfect simultaneous solution, and trust the ripple fire doctrine the ship had drilled for exactly this scenario. The first Aster 30 left the forward silo in a wash of orange light that lit up the deck for a fraction of a second before the missile was gone, arcing out toward the lead contact. The blast of the cold launch ejection, then the roar of the rocket motor, igniting a few dozen meters above the deck, was loud enough that watchstanders 2 decks below felt it through the hull plating. Somewhere on the Yemeni coast, whoever launched that drone had no idea it had just become the first casualty of an engagement that would define how the Royal Navy talks about drone defense for years afterward. 1 down, 7 still inbound. The picture on the screen didn't get calmer. It got worse. 2 of the remaining contacts had split formation, angling toward different bearings, which meant Diamond's fire control now had to track divergent solutions instead of a single tidy line. This was the complication nobody in the pre-deployment briefings had modeled cleanly. Houthi operators adjusting tactics mid-swarm, spreading the axis of attack to strain the ship's engagement sequencing even further. Ripple fire is exactly what it sounds like. Missiles going out in a rapid, deliberate sequence, timed close enough together that the launcher never sits idle, but spaced enough that each Aster gets a clean fire control solution. Each launch meant a fresh cycle through the same compressed loop. Track confirmed, solution generated, weapon assigned, clearance given, cell fired, and then immediately back to the top of the loop for whichever contact had climbed to the top of the priority list in the seconds since. The principal warfare officer's voice on the internal net stayed almost mechanically flat throughout, a deliberate calm that every rating in that room had been trained to hear as normal, even when nothing about the night was normal. Diamond's crew ran the sequence twice more in the space of a couple of minutes, and twice more the tracks on the screen blinked out. 3 down, 4 down. The tension in the room didn't drop with each hit, though. If anything, it climbed, because everyone doing the mental math already understood what came next. Missiles are finite. A Type 45's forward silo holds a set number of rounds, and nobody puts to sea assuming they'll burn through half of it in a single night over a strait they patrol every week. What's most surprising about this case isn't the swarm itself. Houthi forces had been launching drones at shipping for months by this point. It's that a fight this lopsided on paper, a billion-pound air defense destroyer against munitions that cost less than a used car, still came down to a countdown on remaining interceptors, running in parallel with the countdown on remaining drones. Fourth contact gone, fifth gone, and the operations room had cleared more than half the swarm without a single leaker reaching visual range. Solid work. Textbook even. And then the geometry shifted again. Two of the last three drones had dropped altitude, hugging the wave tops in a way that made them harder for the radar to hold a clean lock-on against sea clutter. It's the oldest trick in low-altitude attack, cheap and effective, and it worked exactly as designed, for about 90 seconds. Sea Viper reacquired both tracks, but the delay ate into a margin the crew hadn't budgeted for. This was the fight tightening exactly when everyone expected it to loosen. 6 down, 1 left in the water lane, and 1 that had crossed close enough that the missile solution was no longer the right tool for the job. Here's what this tells us about where naval warfare actually sits right now. The Royal Navy didn't lose that fight. Every single drone in that swarm ended in the water, and Diamond's crew and hardware performed precisely as designed, under exactly the pressure it was designed for. But nobody in that operations room finished the night feeling like they'd won a clean victory, because the cost column never stopped climbing in the wrong direction. 7 Aster 30 missiles, each around £1 million, spent against 7 airframes that Iran and its proxies can apparently produce for a few $1,000s apiece. Run that exchange rate over a long campaign, and the side with the expensive interceptor runs out of money and magazine space long before the side with cheap drones runs out of drones. Scale that single night's exchange rate across a hypothetical month-long campaign of nightly harassment attacks, and the numbers stop being an abstract talking point in a defense white paper and start looking like a resupply crisis waiting to happen somewhere in the Mediterranean or back home in Portsmouth, wherever the next munitions shipment has to originate from. Diamond's 190-odd sailors weren't thinking about defense economics. With 2 contacts still live, they were thinking about the 4.5-inch Mark 8 gun mounted forward, now swinging onto the 7th drone as it closed inside missile engagement range. Too close now for Sea Viper to be the sensible answer. The gun opened up. A different sound entirely from the missile launches. A rapid mechanical hammering instead of a single violent whoosh, shell casings clattering onto the deck plating. Tracers visible even through the haze. This is the part of the fight that doesn't show up cleanly in official statements afterward, the unglamorous close-in gunnery that has to work when the expensive system runs low on time or rounds. It worked. The 7th contact came apart in the air, debris scattering into the sea a few hundred meters off Diamond's port side. 1 left. The 8th drone had been the quiet one the whole engagement, holding a wide bearing well off from the main axis, almost like it was waiting to see what the others drew out. Now it turned inbound, alone, on a ship that had just spent most of its ready air defense capacity destroying its 7 companions. If this had been the actual opening move of a larger, better coordinated attack, that last drone would have been the one that mattered most. Ask yourself what you'd do in that operations room. 60 seconds from the end of an 11-minute fight. 1 Aster left in a ready state. 1 gun crew already deafened by the last engagement, and a single contact bearing down that could still put a warhead into the hull if everyone got sloppy in the closing seconds. The warfare officer running the intercept called a final Sea Viper solution rather than gamble on the gun a second time. Diamond had the missile ready. The last Aster 30 of the engagement left the silo, closed the gap in seconds, and the 8th drone went the same way as the first 7. 8 for 8. 0 leakers. 0 damage to the ship, 0 casualties, 0 disruption to the shipping lane Diamond was there to protect. Below decks, in the grain carrier still holding its course 18 miles ahead, The bridge crew got the all clear from Diamond over bridge-to-bridge radio and kept steaming, most of them never fully understanding how close they'd come to being the actual target if even one of those 8 had gotten through. The relief in that operations room lasted about as long as it takes to realize what the scoreboard actually says once someone starts doing the multiplication. In the days that followed, a small internal review convened aboard Diamond itself. Not a formal board of inquiry, but the kind of after-action debrief every warship runs when it burns through a meaningful fraction of its magazine in a single engagement. Junior officers were asked, one at a time, to walk through their targeting decisions in sequence. Why this contact before that one? Why the gun on the 7th drone and not the 8th? What the fire control system showed at each decision point versus what the human operator chose to trust it on. Nobody was in trouble. Every decision held up against replay. But the questions themselves told their own story. A ship's leadership quietly stress-testing whether the choices that worked with 8 drones would still have worked with 12, and coming away without a comfortable answer. One young weapons engineer, barely 2 years out of training, was reported afterward to have said the thing everyone else was thinking but hadn't said aloud. That watching the missile count drop in real time felt less like winning a fight and more like watching a clock run down on borrowed time. Here's the take that'll probably draw some pushback. This was not the unambiguous success the official statements made it sound like. Every drone splashed, yes. But an air defense system built to counter Soviet-era anti-ship missiles just spent the better part of its ready magazine holding off weapons that, individually, are barely more sophisticated than a hobbyist aircraft with a warhead strapped on. If the Houthi campaign in the Red Sea had thrown 20 drones that night instead of 8, or 40, the honest answer from anyone in that room is that nobody knows for certain where the math finally breaks. The MOD's own public statements after similar Red Sea engagements leaned hard into the success framing. Drones intercepted, shipping lane protected, no British casualties. All true. None of it addressed the exchange rate problem out loud, because doing so publicly is close to admitting that the most advanced air defense destroyer in the fleet is playing a losing economic game even while winning every tactical engagement. We dug through Royal Navy and MOD statements from across the Red Sea deployment, and one detail kept surfacing in slightly different language each time. Officials repeatedly noting the cost gap between an Aster 30 and a Houthi drone, almost as if the point needed saying more than once before anyone above them would act on it. There's a quieter piece of this story that rarely makes it into the coverage: what happens to the wreckage. In the days after actions like this one, coalition forces in the region have on occasion recovered drone debris that washed ashore or was fished out of shallow water near the strait, and passed pieces of it to intelligence analysts working to reverse engineer the guidance electronics and confirm the supply chain back to Iran. Circuit boards, servo motors, sometimes intact warhead fusing assemblies, laid out on a table and photographed component by component, cross-referenced against components recovered from unrelated seizures of Iranian arms shipments intercepted elsewhere in the region. It's slow, unglamorous work, and it rarely produces a single smoking gun document. What it produces instead is a pattern, repeated shipment after shipment, component after component, that leaves the diplomatic language of Iranian-linked doing a lot of quiet, careful lifting in every subsequent government statement. By the time Diamond's crew stood down from action stations, the sun still hadn't come up over the strait. The ship's magazine held noticeably fewer Aster 30 rounds than it had 11 minutes earlier. Somewhere in Whitehall, the after-action reports from that night, and others like it across the deployment, started feeding into a conversation the Royal Navy hadn't wanted to have this urgently. What happens to a fleet's air defense doctrine when the enemy's ammunition costs less than the interceptor's paperwork? Diamond herself sailed on, finished her deployment, and returned home without a scratch from the engagement. Commander Aldous and his crew were credited, in official language, with defending the shipping lane and demonstrating that Sea Viper worked exactly as designed against a saturation attack. Every open question from that night got answered in the most literal sense. How many drones? How many missiles? How long it took? What got hit? The uncomfortable question nobody could fully close out was the one about what happens the next time the number isn't 8. That single night became a quiet turning point in how Western navies think about the next decade of naval combat. Cheap drone swarms aren't a hypothetical anymore, and an 11-minute engagement in the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait turned the cost-per-kill argument from a slide in a Pentagon briefing into a lived, counted, budgeted reality for one specific ship and one specific crew. Navies from Washington to Canberra have been quietly accelerating cheaper interceptor programs and directed energy weapons ever since, precisely because nobody wants their own version of this night to end with a bigger number than 8. The Royal Navy itself has since pushed forward trials of laser weapon systems and cheaper missile variants explicitly framed around this exact engagement, a rare case of a single night's arithmetic visibly reshaping a procurement roadmap that normally moves at the pace of decades, not months. If you've made it this far, here's the honest, unanswered piece we couldn't fully verify on camera. How close the Royal Navy actually came, that specific night, to running its ready Sea Viper stock below the threshold it needs for a follow-on attack. Drop a comment if you've seen sourcing on that. We'll pin the best one. Would you have called the gun or gambled the last missile in that final 60 seconds? Tell us in the comments. And if you want the follow-up on how the Royal Navy is actually rebuilding its defenses around this exact problem, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss it. Like this video if you want more of these minute-by-minute breakdowns, and we'll see you in the next one.